Welcome back to the GPU hierarchy. This is an oldie but goodie, Cyberpunk 2077. Came out originally in 2022, 5 years ago, and you would think with 5 years of new hardware, 5 years of game updates, 5 years of change, we would have way better performance in this old game, and we certainly do. But I want to show you the past 2 generations of graphics cards running this still brutally intensive game. And I'm not even going to bother with path tracing, full ray tracing, whatever you want to call it. It does exist, and it punishes all GPUs pretty harshly. You really need to use upscaling, even frame generation technologies to get a good performance that way. So, instead of looking at path tracing, let's just go ahead and use the regular old medium setting with some ray tracing features. We've got medium lighting and RT reflections enabled, and here's how things stack up. At the top, naturally, is the RTX 5090, pulling 164 frames per second, minimums down around 105, 106 frames per second. The next fastest GPU is the 4090, not the 5080, the 4090. 5080 is still a good step down, sitting around 122. Going down the list, we've got the 4080 Super, 4080 basically tied, just a couple of percent difference. 5070 Ti comes next, followed by the 4070 Ti Super. Not a big gap between those two, old and new generation. Finally, we get AMD's RX 9070 XT sitting at 92 frames per second. That's a bit more than half as fast as the 5090, and of course it does cost, well, a lot less than half as much as the going rate for a 5090. 4070 Ti, 5070, 4070 Super, all relatively close together. All of those are 12GB cards as well. And then we get a couple more AMD GPUs, the 9070, the 7900 XT. In ray tracing, isn't that interesting? AMD's new RDNA 4 second tier GPU, the 9070 non-XT, actually does outpace the 7900 XTX. Then a little bit slower than those, at 70 FPS, we have the 4070, 7900 XT. Then we get the 5060 Ti, 16GB and 8GB models. Notice that the 8GB model is basically the same performance in this old game at medium settings with ray tracing on some options enabled. 7900 GRE comes in just below the 5060 Ti, and then we've got the 4060 Ti and 4060 Ti 16GB. Those again are basically tied, but this time the 8GB card just edges out its 16GB brother. And that's because the 16GB tends to clock a bit lower in this case. Card model differences. 7800 XT, 7700 XT. Intel's Arc B580 finally shows up, 5th from the bottom, at 44 frames per second, just edging past the RTX 4060. And then we have the B570. Finally, we get AMD's RX 7600 XT and the RX 7600. You can see in the background, kind of behind the graph, I've got the benchmark path that I'm running through Night City. This is a pretty complex area with a lot of people and crowds and cars and all this stuff going on in the daytime. And it's a little bit more demanding, I've found, than the built-in benchmark, but also a little bit more consistent in terms of getting the real-world performance. Let's go ahead then and kick things up to RT Ultra. Again, this is not path tracing. This is the original RT Ultra setting, which has probably changed over the 5 years since the game came out, but let's not worry about that too much. Tends to be actually pretty CPU limited, even with the Ryzen 7 9800X3D. So both the 5090 and 4090 are getting around 110, 112 frames per second. 5080 is a little bit below those at 103. The order hasn't really changed too much from our medium settings, medium RT settings, but the gaps between them have condensed a bit. That's because we're at 1080p and CPU limited. Once we hit 1440p, you'll see that the spread really widens out. But let's go ahead and go down the list. AMD's best, still the 9070 XT, falling just below the 4070 Ti Super and just above the 4070 Ti. The 7900 XTX, which sits way down at 60 frames per second, still again slower than the new 9070. 9070 though, still going for almost $800, sometimes more. Not a great value at current prices because the 5070 is available at $600 to $650, and that pretty much lands between the 9070 XT and the 9070. And Nvidia also has better DLSS upscaling features available, as well as frame generation features. So these are the native rendering performance results, and that's because I view frame generation and upscaling more as performance enhancers that you can use to try and boost your frame rate and experience if the defaults aren't working as well as you'd like. Looking down, 16GB versus 8GB. Still not much of a gap on the 5060 Ti and the 4060 Ti. The minimums do take more of a hit, it looks like, on the 8GB cards. There is an exception to that statement, of course. AMD's 7600 XT and 7600, we see a much bigger gap there. AMD seems to need a little bit more memory than Nvidia to get roughly equivalent behavior in games. The Arc B580 comes in just behind the 7800 XT, which is kind of interesting, ahead of the 4060 still, ahead of the 7700 XT as well. And that about does it for 1080p with RT Ultra. Once we jump up to 1440p, the spread really widens out, especially at the top. The 5090 did lose a little bit of performance, lost about 10% of its performance, but the 4090 lost about 30%, something like that. Dropped from 112, I think, to 81, so 30 frames per second drop versus 10 frames per second. We've gone from being primarily CPU limited at the top to being very much GPU limited, and that's why everything spreads out. Once we get down to the 12GB cards like the 4070 Ti, 5070, those are just behind AMD's fastest 9070 XT still, which has 16GB. The 9070 still outpacing the 7900 XTX, even though it has less memory bandwidth, less memory, less compute in theory, but it has much better ray tracing hardware. So AMD did improve their ray tracing hardware with RDNA 4. 4070 just edges past the 5060 Ti 16GB. That's kind of interesting. Like, you would think those would be more of a gap, but they're not. And then we get 7900 XT, 7900 GRE, 4060 Ti 16GB. We take a big drop on the 8GB versus 16GB cards this time though. Look at the 5060 Ti 16GB is at 33 frames per second versus 22 frames per second on the 8GB card. Similar numbers on the 4060 Ti, or a similar gap at least, 27 frames per second, drops down to 21 frames per second. And this is important because you could legitimately run with upscaling and frame generation on the 16GB models and probably get a pretty good experience in Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p. But with those 8GB cards, they're already taking a performance hit due to lack of VRAM, and the hit becomes even bigger when you start turning on frame generation and upscaling features. They don't hold up as well as I would like. I really don't like those 8GB cards in 2025. They shouldn't really exist, but that was an Nvidia profit-making decision. Then finally, we'll wrap up with 4K RT Ultra, still at native. Even the 5090, not quite managing 60 frames per second, comes up just a bit shy at 55 FPS. Obviously, turning on DLSS upscaling would really give a nice performance boost there. You could probably get back close to the 110 FPS CPU limit. And then if you do frame generation, you could even do multi-frame generation and get up into that 250 frames per second. It's not really 250 frames per second though. Multi-frame generation does not feel the same as native rendering, which is again why I don't like to look at frame gen, multi-frame gen, and upscaling as a baseline performance comparison, but you can play with those and the experience isn't necessarily going to be bad. AMD's 9070 XT still falling just below the 4070 Ti Super, just above the 4070 Ti. The 9070 still just edging out the 7900 XTX. The rest of the cards, obviously these aren't really playable results. I mean, if you had a baseline performance at 4K native of around 30 frames per second, even 25 frames per second, and you turned on upscaling and maybe even frame gen, you can get really good performance and still have the game look good, especially if you're using like DLSS transformers on Nvidia's cards. That actually looks pretty dang close to native, even with like balanced or performance mode upscaling. You can make the argument, you can turn those on and not suffer that much of an image quality loss. It's not perfect, but it's really good. 8GB cards are really hurting now as well. They're running about half as fast as the 16GB models. And something else to note there is that those 16GB cards, even though they're not providing playable performance, 16 frames per second on the 5060 Ti 16GB, they are a consistent experience, whereas if you got the 8GB cards, sometimes you'll reload a save or you'll load a new area because you fast travel and performance will just die off. Like I've seen it drop to slideshow 1 frame per second or less. So 8GB cards are really struggling in certain settings with modern games, especially the more demanding ones, like even a 5-year-old Cyberpunk 2077. Anyway, this is GPU hierarchy. Just wanted to go through all the current and prior generation cards to show you how they stack up. Obviously at the top, 5090 is pretty much untouchable. It's also untouchable on price. It costs almost 3 times as much as the second most expensive GPU. Well, I guess if we count the 4090, that still goes for $1,500 to $2,000 these days, even though it's over 2 years old. But the 5080, you can sometimes find that for $1,200-ish. $1,400 are easy to find. That's less than half the price of the going rate for 5090, at least in the US. And you've got AMD's 9070 XT, that typically costs under $1,000. At that point, though, you'd be looking at the 5070 Ti because that also costs under $1,000. That's it. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. This is just a short and sweet, focused on one game that's older, but it's still a popular game and it's still very demanding. Please like and subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and we will see you next time.